Hey there, and welcome back to Drowsy History. Tonight we are going somewhere ancient, somewhere blazing hot, somewhere full of gold and grandeur on the surface, and backbreaking, thankless, genuinely dangerous labor just beneath it. We are going to ancient Egypt, not to visit the pharaoh, not to marvel at the throne or the crown or the layers of ritual and divine power draped over one human being like the most expensive costume in history. No, tonight we are going to stand just behind all of that, in the shadow of it, where the servants lived, the people who woke before the pharaoh and went to sleep long after him, the ones who dressed him and fed him and carried him and fanned him and cleaned up after him and dedicated their entire existence to the maintenance of a single man who believed himself to be a living god. The ones history barely mentions by name, the ones who built the world we still marvel at today and received very little in return except more work. It sucked to be a pharaoh's servant, and tonight we are going to find out exactly why. Before we ease into their world, if you are new here and this kind of slow, quiet historical storytelling helps you wind down at night, please consider subscribing to Drowsy History. It takes just a moment, and it means the world to the channel. And when you wake up, or right now if you are still with me, drop a comment letting me know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I love imagining so many people in so many different corners of the world all settling into the same quiet darkness together. There is no pressure to follow every detail tonight, no quiz waiting at the end. Just let the words drift over you like warm sand, and if sleep takes you before we get to the end, that is exactly what this is for. So get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let us step back together into the heat and dust and impossible demands of ancient Egypt, where one man's comfort required thousands of others to never truly rest. To understand what it meant to serve a pharaoh, you first have to understand what a pharaoh was. Not just a king, not just a ruler, something far more complicated and far more demanding than either of those titles suggest. The pharaoh in ancient Egyptian belief was not simply a man who had been given power over other men. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth. When he died, he became Osiris, ruler of the dead. He was the point at which the divine and the earthly touched. He was the guarantor of Ma, the cosmic order that held everything in place, the flooding of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the fertility of the soil, the outcome of battle. All of it depended, in the Egyptian worldview, on the pharaoh performing his sacred duties correctly. If the pharaoh was properly honored, properly fed, properly clothed, properly attended in every moment of his life, Ma'at was maintained. If he was not, the entire universe could tip toward chaos. This theology had an immediate and very practical consequence for everyone around him. It meant that serving the pharaoh was not merely employment. It was a sacred obligation. It was a cosmic duty. Every cup of wine poured correctly, every robe arranged with perfect precision, every fan waved at exactly the right angle to keep the divine body cool. These were not small tasks performed by unimportant people. They were acts of religious significance performed in the most demanding and unforgiving workplace in the ancient world. The servants of the pharaoh were not a single uniform category of person. They were a vast and diverse population arranged in their own internal hierarchy that mirrored the broader hierarchy of Egyptian society. At the very top of the servant class, if top is even the right word for a position that was still fundamentally one of service, were the high officials who managed the royal household, the overseer of the royal household, the steward of the king's house, the chief butler. These were men of genuine administrative power who commanded large staffs, managed enormous budgets, and wielded real influence over the daily operations of one of the most complex institutions in the ancient world. Their titles sounded grand, their responsibilities were crushing. Below them stretched layer after layer of specialists, cooks and bakers and brewers, butchers and pastry makers, weavers and launderers, sandal bearers and fan bearers and robe keepers, physicians and scribes and musicians, perfumers and cosmeticians, door openers and water carriers, barbers who shaved the royal head, priests who performed the daily ritual of awakening the divine body with prayer and incense, and the careful presentation of food to the God King, guards who stood in silence outside doorways for hours without moving, gardeners who maintained the palace grounds, animal keepers who managed the menagerie of exotic creatures that various pharaohs collected, craftspeople who repaired and maintained every object in the palace, messengers who ran communications across enormous distances in the heat. Further down still were the laborers, the people who carried things, built things, cleaned things, the ones who hauled water from the Nile, who scrubbed the floors of corridors that stretched for hundreds of feet, who loaded and unloaded the constant stream of tribute and goods flowing into and out of the royal residence. And woven through all of this were the enslaved people, a population that grew significantly during the New Kingdom period as Egypt's military campaigns brought prisoners of war home in large numbers. Their labor was the foundation upon which the more visible service rested. They had the least and were expected to give the most. This entire population, from the chief steward to the water carrier at the bottom, shared one essential condition. Their lives were not their own. Their time was not their own. Their bodies were not entirely their own. They existed to serve, and the standard of that service was not merely high, it was divine. The day in the royal household did not begin when the pharaoh woke up. It began hours before that, in the deep dark of the pre-dawn, when the servants whose duties belonged to the morning rushed through their own preparations so that by the time the divine body stirred from sleep, everything would be in perfect readiness. There was no margin for error in this. There was no such thing as a slow start or a small mistake that could be quietly corrected. The morning ritual of waking the pharaoh was a religious ceremony, and religious ceremonies in ancient Egypt were performed with an exactness that left no room for human frailty. The priests and servants responsible for the morning ritual of the pharaoh were essentially performing the same ceremony that temple priests performed each morning for the divine statues of the gods housed in Egypt's great temples. The logic was the same. A divine being needed to be awakened, purified, clothed, fed, and prepared to interact with the world. The steps were prescribed. The words were prescribed. The sequence was prescribed. And every person involved had a precisely defined role that had to be executed without deviation. Before the pharaoh himself was approached, the chamber had to be prepared. This meant servants working by lamplight in the early hours, ensuring that the room was clean, that the air was appropriately scented with the incense that accompanied all sacred acts, that the objects needed for the morning rituals were arranged in the correct positions. The robes that would be placed on the divine body had to be inspected and found perfect. The oils and perfumes had to be prepared. The food that would be presented as a morning offering had to be made ready. The servants who performed these tasks did so in near silence. The atmosphere was not that of a household getting ready for the day. It was that of a temple preparing for a sacred rite. Speaking at the wrong moment, making an unnecessary sound, dropping something, fumbling with an arrangement. Any of these could be interpreted not merely as carelessness, but as a disruption of the sacred order. The consequences of disruption in a divine household were not just professional, they were, in the Egyptian understanding of the world, potentially cosmic. When the pharaoh finally stirred and the formal morning ritual began, the sequence was elaborate. Specific priests chanted prayers acknowledging the divine nature of the being awakening before them. The pharaoh would be assisted from his bed, and the process of the morning toilet would begin. This was not a private matter. There was no concept of private for a living god in ancient Egypt, or at least not the kind of privacy that modern people would recognize. The intimate acts of washing and grooming were attended by servants and priests whose specific roles made them participants in a sacred rite rather than merely witnesses to something personal. The washing of the pharaoh's body was performed with ritual water, water that in temple contexts would have been purified through specific ceremonies. The body was anointed with oils and perfumes of specific types applied in a specific sequence. The quality and fragrance of these preparations were not incidental. Certain oils were associated with specific deities. The cedar oil, the myrrh, the precious Kai incense that featured in royal preparations were not luxuries in our sense. They were theological statements about the nature of the being prepared. Then came the clothing. The pharaoh's wardrobe was vast, intricate, and hierarchically organized by occasion and ceremony. The servant responsible for presenting the correct garment for a given moment had to have a thorough knowledge of this system. Presenting the wrong robe for the occasion was not a minor error. The symbolism embedded in Egyptian royal dress was dense and meaningful. Getting it wrong communicated the wrong theological message about the king's divine role on a given day. The linen that clothed the pharaoh had to be of the whitest and finest quality, soft and perfectly pressed, smelling of the cedar chests and herbs in which it was stored. The act of dressing the pharaoh was itself attended by specific ritual words. The false beard, the double crown or whichever crown the day required, the crook and flail or their ritual substitutes, the collar of gold and precious stones, the armlets and bracelets and rings. All of these had to be assembled and presented in the correct order by servants who had been trained in these procedures and who had no room to forget or improvise. By the time the pharaoh was fully dressed and presented, hours had passed. Hours in which the servants, responsible for each element of the morning ritual, had been performing their duties with an intensity of focus and a suppression of personal need that most of us would find genuinely difficult to sustain. No one asked them if they had slept well. No one checked whether they had eaten. No one inquired about the stiffness in a back that had bent over a preparation table in lamplight since the middle of the night. The divine body was ready. That was what mattered. That was the only thing that mattered. If the morning ritual was a sacred ceremony, the feeding of the pharaoh was a sacred industry. The royal kitchen of ancient Egypt was not a single room with a cooking fire and a handful of cooks. It was a complex operation involving dozens or hundreds of workers across multiple specialized departments, each focused on a narrow category of food or drink, all contributing to the daily task of producing meals that were first and foremost theological statements about Egypt's abundance and the pharaoh's divine centrality to that abundance. The scale of it was staggering. Lists preserved from various periods of Egyptian history record the daily food allocations of the royal household, and they read like inventories of impossible consumption. Hundreds of loaves of bread of various types and grades, dozens of jars of beer, including the premium varieties reserved for divine and royal consumption, multiple types of meat, including beef, goat, duck, and the various game birds that were a feature of elite Egyptian diet, fish from the Nile, honey and dates and figs, vegetables and legumes, oils and fats, cakes and sweet preparations whose ingredients required procurement from across the known world. All of this had to be produced every single day. Not most of it, not approximately it, all of it, prepared to the standards required by the divine household, on time, in the correct vessels, in the quantities prescribed by the administrative record. The bakers worked before dawn. Bread in ancient Egypt was not the simple unified category it is today. Egyptian bakers produced at least 30 or 40 distinct types of bread, differentiated by shape, grain type, addition of honey or fat or fruit, degree of leavening, and purpose. Certain breads were offerings for the gods. Certain breads were served to the pharaoh at specific meals. Certain breads formed part of the compensation given to palace workers. The baker who confused these categories, who sent the wrong bread to the wrong destination, had not just made a kitchen error, he had potentially disrupted the religious economy of the palace. Grinding grain for bread was the foundational labor on which all of this rested, and it was brutally hard work. Archaeological study of skeletal remains from ancient Egypt has revealed in striking detail what a lifetime of grain grinding did to the human body. The women, and it was primarily women, who spent their lives kneeling at grinding stones, developed distinctive arthritic changes in their knees, hips, and spines. Their toe bones showed the stress of hours spent kneeling with toes bent. Their arm and shoulder bones showed the asymmetric development of the dominant grinding arm. The condition of their teeth, damaged by the grit that inevitably found its way into ground flour, told its own story of a life spent in daily physical cost to feed a system that regarded them as productive units rather than as people. Brewing was equally intensive. Egyptian beer was not the light recreational drink of modern imagination. It was a thick, nutritious, lightly fermented beverage made from bread or grain that served as both food and drink for the population. The royal breweries produced multiple grades and types. Premium beers were flavored with date or pomegranate or other additions that elevated them above the common drink. These required their own careful preparation and their own specialist knowledge. The butchers worked on animals that had to be inspected, slaughtered, and processed according to the ritual requirements of divine consumption. The meat that reached the pharaoh's table had passed through a chain of ritual and practical steps intended to ensure its purity and suitability for a divine body. The birds required their own specialists. Game hunting and fishing expeditions supplied additional protein that required cleaning and preparation on arrival. The cooks who actually assembled these components into finished dishes worked in conditions that were, in blunt terms, brutal. Egyptian kitchens operated over open fires in a climate that was already hot. The temperature in a palace kitchen during the Egyptian summer, with multiple fires burning and dozens of people working in close quarters, would have been genuinely dangerous by any standard. Heat stroke, burns from open fires, burns from spilled cooking fats, respiratory stress from smoke, exhaustion from hours of physical labor over heat. All of these were occupational realities for the cooks who fed the God King. And after all of that preparation, the food was carried to where it would be presented, and a portion of it was offered to the divine being through the mechanism of the offering ritual before the pharaoh himself ate. The theological understanding was that the gods consumed the essence of the offering, leaving the physical substance behind. The physical substance then passed back through the system to feed the palace staff, the priests, and eventually the workers who made the whole thing possible. In theory, it was a cycle that honored everyone involved. In practice, by the time the redistributed food reached the lower rungs of the palace hierarchy, it had traveled a long way from the premium products prepared that morning in the royal kitchen. The servants responsible for carrying food from the kitchen to the royal presence had their own precise protocol to follow. The presentation of food to the pharaoh was not simply a matter of bringing dishes to a table. It was an act of service, loaded with ritual meaning, and the bearing, posture, and manner of the servants who performed it were regulated by the same concern for divine propriety that governed everything else in the royal household. A wrong gesture, a stumble, a spill, these were not merely embarrassing, they were potentially sacrilegious. Of all the positions in the royal household, the ones closest to the pharaoh's physical person were simultaneously the most prestigious and the most suffocating. The body servants, those who attended the pharaoh directly during the various rituals and activities of his day, occupied a position that every ambitious Egyptian might theoretically aspire to, while every person of genuine self awareness might secretly dread. Yes, you were close to the most powerful person in the known world. Yes, your proximity to the pharaoh meant access to information, to gifts, to patronage, to the possibility of influence. But you paid for that proximity with your freedom in a way that even other palace servants did not. Consider the fan bearer. This position sounds almost comical from the outside, but it was a genuine and demanding role. The pharaoh's comfort was sacred, and in the heat of Egypt, keeping that body comfortable meant keeping it cool. The fan bearer stood in proximity to the pharaoh during audiences, ceremonies, meals, and processions, holding an enormous fan of ostrich feathers on a long handle and maintaining a steady, rhythmic movement of air for hours at a time. Not too fast, not too slow, not stopping when the arm grew heavy, not shifting posture noticeably when the back ached, not allowing the attention to waver, not reacting to things seen or heard from that position of intimate access because a fan bearer who gossiped or who was known to be paying attention to the conversations he stood beside was a security risk and a liability. The physical demand of this work was real. Holding a large fan on a long handle at the correct angle and keeping it moving steadily for hours is a genuine muscular challenge. The stability required, the suppression of the natural shifting and fidgeting that the body wants to do, the maintenance of an expression of composed attention through hours of physical strain in the heat. This was work. It just didn't look like work from the outside. The sandal bearer walked behind or beside the pharaoh during certain ceremonial contexts, carrying the divine footwear when the pharaoh was not wearing it. This also sounds trivial. It was not. The sandal bearer had to maintain the correct proximity to the pharaoh at all times, close enough to present the sandals at exactly the moment they were needed, far enough to maintain the appropriate spatial relationships of divine hierarchy. He had to be attentive without appearing to be watching. He had to be present without being obtrusive. He had to move at the exact pace of the pharaoh across any terrain in any conditions without stumbling or drawing attention to himself. The royal barber had perhaps the most intimate access of all. The head of the pharaoh, adorned or plain, shaved or wigged, was part of the divine body that required management. Royal heads were shaved and then covered with elaborate wigs for official functions, or with specific headdresses whose symbolic meanings were dense and important. The barber who worked on the divine head was touching the body of a god with his hands. He was in a position where a slip, a cut, even a slightly too firm touch could damage the sacred person. The trust extended to a royal barber was extraordinary. So was the potential for catastrophe if anything went wrong. The personal physicians occupied their own particular position in this world of intimate service. Egyptian medicine was sophisticated by the standards of the ancient world, combining genuine empirical observation with a magical and religious framework that saw illness as potentially caused by spiritual as well as physical factors. The royal physician was responsible for the health of the most important body in Egypt. If the pharaoh fell ill, the entire cosmic order was potentially disrupted. The divine body experiencing weakness, pain, or incapacity was a theological crisis as much as a medical one. The physician managing this situation was working under pressure that no modern medical professional has ever exactly replicated. And if the pharaoh died, pharaohs did die. They died of the same diseases and injuries that killed everyone else, and their divinity did not protect them from tooth infections, parasites, arterial disease, battle wounds, or old age. Several royal mummies examined with modern imaging technology show conditions that must have caused significant chronic pain. The physician who failed to keep the pharaoh alive had failed in the most profound possible sense. The consequences of such failure were not spelled out consistently across all periods of Egyptian history, but the weight of responsibility under which the royal physician practiced was real, and it was crushing. No account of what it meant to serve the pharaoh would be complete without looking at the builders, because the monuments that still define Egypt in the imagination of the world, the pyramids, the great temples, the colossal statues, the obelisks that were eventually distributed around the globe as the prizes of later empires. All of these were built by human bodies, human hands that cut stone, human backs that carried it, human knees that ground against rock floors, human lungs that filled with stone dust. The monuments endured. The people who built them, for the most part, did not. The old image of pyramid building as pure slave labor driven by whips has been significantly revised by archaeology over the past several decades. Excavations at Giza have uncovered the village of the pyramid workers and revealed a population that was housed, fed, and given medical attention, whose injured members had bones that show signs of surgical intervention and healing, who were buried with some care and respect. This was not the condition of people treated as disposable animals. It was the condition of people whose labor was considered valuable enough to maintain. But valued labor extracted under compulsion from people who had no meaningful choice about whether to provide it is still compulsion. The workers who built the pyramids were conscripted through the labor tax system, a form of obligatory service that the Egyptian state imposed on its population. You gave a portion of your productive time to the state. In the case of the great building projects, this meant seasons of work at the pyramid site, away from your family, your farm, your village, in conditions that were organized and provided for, but were not what you would have chosen for yourself. The scale of what they were asked to do is difficult to convey. The Great Pyramid of Khufu contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of around 2.5 to 15 tons. Some of the largest blocks weigh significantly more. These stones were quarried, transported, and placed with a precision that still provokes amazement from engineers and architects today. The logistics of feeding, housing, organizing, supplying, and directing the tens of thousands of workers required to achieve this were themselves an administrative feat of the first order. The workers themselves were organized in gangs with names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkar, names that suggest an esprit de corps, a group identity that perhaps made the work more bearable. They competed, apparently, in the completeness and speed of their contributions. Records of their rations have survived. They received bread, beer, onions, garlic, fish, and sometimes meat. These were not starvation rations. They were the fuel of heavy physical labor, calculated to keep bodies working. But the work itself was punishing in ways that the careful provisioning could not fully offset. Quarrying limestone in the desert heat, using copper tools that had to be frequently resharpened because they dulled against stone, working in the noise and dust of a site where thousands of people were simultaneously cutting and moving stone. This was brutal physical labor without any of the mechanical assistance that makes large-scale construction possible today. Everything that moved was moved by human muscle, human ingenuity applied to sledges and ramps and ropes and levers. The injuries were real and common. The skeletal evidence from worker burials shows fractures, crushing injuries, arthritic damage from years of heavy load bearing, spinal degeneration from the repetitive lifting and carrying that constituted most of a worker's day. The medical care they received was genuine, but it was the medical care available to the ancient world, which could set bones and treat wounds, but could not do much about the cumulative damage of years of hard physical labor in harsh conditions. And what did they build it for? For the eternal life of a man who believed himself to be a god and whose transition from this world to the next required a monument of impossible scale to house his preserved body and all the possessions he would need for eternity. The pyramid was the pharaoh's forever home, built at a cost and human effort that the pharaoh himself never personally experienced. He visited the site. He presided over ceremonies. He received reports on the progress. He did not lift a stone. The workers went home eventually, those who survived. They returned to their villages, carrying injuries that would worsen with age, memories of years spent at the edge of human physical capacity, and the knowledge that they had contributed to something larger than themselves. Whether that knowledge felt like pride or like the residue of an obligation they had not been given the option to decline. The historical record is silent on this question, as it is silent on so many of the things that mattered most to the people who could not write their own version of events. There is a practice in the early history of ancient Egypt that represents the most absolute expression of what it meant to be a servant of the pharaoh. In the earliest dynastic periods, the centuries immediately following the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, when the great early pharaohs were establishing the institution of divine kingship in its most extreme and uncompromising form. Some of the pharaoh's servants were buried with him when he died, not symbolically, not in effigy, physically. The actual bodies of actual people who had served the pharaoh in life were placed in the subsidiary chambers surrounding the royal burial, interred to continue their service in the afterlife. The evidence comes from the royal cemetery at Abydos, where the tombs of the earliest pharaohs have been excavated with increasing sophistication over the past century and a half. The subsidiary burials around these royal tombs contain the remains of young men and women, many of them killed at the time of the royal burial rather than dying naturally beforehand. Analysis of some of these burials has suggested the cause of death was deliberate. They were the pharaoh's people, and when the pharaoh went to meet the gods, some of his people went with him to ensure he continued to be properly attended in whatever existence lay on the other side. This practice was relatively short lived in Egyptian history. By the Old Kingdom, the period of the great pyramid builders, it had been replaced by symbolic substitution. Instead of actual servants, the pharaoh's tomb was populated with statues, the so-called Shabti figures that were placed in tombs throughout later Egyptian history. These were small figurines whose magical function was to animate and perform labor in the afterlife on behalf of the deceased. The inscribed spell on many Shabti figures makes their purpose clear. When called upon to do any work in the realm of the dead, the Shabti would answer, "Here I am," and go in the owner's place. The pharaoh would continue to have servants in the afterlife without the inconvenience of those servants needing to actually die to get there. The shift from actual human sacrifice to symbolic Shabti figures tells us something meaningful about how Egyptian civilization developed, but it does not erase the reality of that early period when the most literal possible interpretation of the servant's relationship to the pharaoh was enacted at the moment of royal death. For the period when this practice was in use, the people who served the pharaoh lived with a specific knowledge that most of us will never have to carry. They knew that if they were among the chosen, if they were considered sufficiently important to the pharaoh's needs, they might be selected to accompany him into death. We do not know how they felt about this. We do not know whether it was regarded with terror or with something more complex, a sense of honor mixed with the natural biological resistance to death that no ideology entirely suppresses. We know only that they died, that they were placed in small chambers near their master, and that they have lain there for 5,000 years. Even in the later periods, when physical sacrifice was no longer practiced, the shadow of this theology persisted in the form of the demands made on servants' bodies and lives in service to the concept of the divine king. A system that had once literally consumed its servants in the name of royal service continued to demand extraordinary sacrifice from them in every other way. The servant who spent a lifetime in palace service had given something irreplaceable: time, youth, physical capacity, the possibility of an ordinary life, in exchange for what the system considered appropriate compensation and the honor of proximity to the divine. Not all suffering in the pharaoh's service came from physical labor. Some of it came from the particular and peculiar demands of the most valued skill in ancient Egyptian society. Reading and writing in ancient Egypt was genuinely rare. The Egyptian writing system, a complex combination of phonetic signs and ideograms that could be rendered in the elaborate hieroglyphic form used for monuments and sacred contexts, or in the faster hieratic script used for administrative and everyday writing, or later in the even more simplified Demotic script, was not something you picked up casually. Learning to write Egyptian hieroglyphics with professional competence required years of dedicated study, and the people who possessed this skill were the administrative nervous system of one of the most organized states in the ancient world. Scribes were everywhere that administration was needed, which in Egypt meant they were everywhere. They recorded grain harvests. They wrote legal documents. They copied religious texts. They maintained military records. They managed the logistics of building projects. They corresponded on behalf of officials who needed to communicate across the enormous distances of the Egyptian state. They wrote letters for people who could not write and read letters to people who could not read. And in the royal household, they were the mechanism through which every aspect of the pharaoh's administrative and documentary world was organized and maintained. The training required to become a scribe was long and physically demanding in its own way. The student scribe spent years copying texts, religious works, administrative documents, literary classics, instructional literature about how to behave properly in the world. The goal was not just literacy, but the internalization of an entire textual tradition. A well-trained Egyptian scribe was a walking library of his culture's important documents. His value was directly proportional to the completeness of this internalized knowledge. The posture of the Egyptian scribe, sitting cross-legged with the papyrus or practice surface on the lap, hunching forward over the work, moving the arm in the precise strokes required by the hieratic or hieroglyphic script, was one that maintained over years and decades of practice produced its own body of occupational damage. The curved spine of someone who has spent a working lifetime bent over writing surfaces. The strain in the hand and wrist from the repetitive motion of careful scribal work. The damage to the eyes from years of close work in the variable and often inadequate light of Egyptian interiors. The demand placed on royal scribes was constant. A pharaoh's administration generated enormous quantities of documentary work. The records of tribute received from subject peoples and from Egypt's own provinces had to be maintained with exactness. Correspondence with foreign powers had to be drafted, copied, and archived. Religious and ceremonial texts required constant copying and maintenance. The accounts of the royal household, recording every jar of oil consumed and every bolt of linen distributed, had to be kept with a precision that would withstand administrative review. The scribes responsible for royal correspondence worked in particular proximity to power and under particular pressure. A letter from the pharaoh to a foreign king was a document of diplomatic significance. The phrasing, the forms of address, the ordering of requests and assertions of status, all of this had to be precisely right. A poorly worded letter could constitute an insult to a foreign ruler or a weakening of Egypt's negotiating position. A scribe who made such errors had not merely made a professional mistake, he had potentially embarrassed the living God. And yet, for all of this, the scribe held a position that Egyptian literature enthusiastically promoted as superior to every other. The famous text known as the Satire of the Trades makes the case with cheerful brutality. Every other occupation is described as miserable, painful, degrading, or dangerous, while the scribe sits comfortably, directs others, and has no heavy work to perform. This was the propaganda of literacy, the elite's argument for its own value. And like most such arguments, it contained enough truth to be convincing while glossing over the very real costs of the scribal life. If the scribes were the administrative nervous system of the pharaoh's Egypt, the soldiers were its muscle. Military service in ancient Egypt was another form of service to the divine king, and it carried its own very particular costs. The Egyptian military evolved significantly across the 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, from the relatively modest domestic force of the Old Kingdom to the professional, chariot-equipped army of the New Kingdom Empire that fought in Syria, Palestine, Nubia, Libya, and beyond. But across all of these periods, the fundamental experience of the common soldier, the man who fought, marched, and died in the Pharaoh's name without any expectation of individual glory or personal choice, remained substantially consistent. Conscription worked on the same labor tax principle as the construction gangs. In times of military need, men were levied from villages across Egypt, assessed for fitness, equipped by the state to varying degrees of adequacy, and marched to wherever the pharaoh's ambitions required them to go. A New Kingdom campaign into Canaan meant Egyptian peasants who had never left the Nile Valley walking through the Sinai Desert, drinking water that may or may not be available at the next stop, eating rations that varied in quality and quantity depending on the efficiency of the supply system, sleeping on the ground in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively dangerous. The physical demands of a military campaign were severe. The Egyptian soldier was an infantryman in the first instance, carrying a shield and weapons, spear, axe, bow, or some combination, and marching on foot across terrain that was nothing like the flat agricultural land of the Nile Valley. The campaigns into Nubia to the south meant navigating the cataracts of the Nile and the brutal heat of sub-Saharan Africa. The campaigns into Libya meant the western desert. The campaigns into the Levant meant the mountains and valleys of modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, with their own logistical challenges and military hazards. Battle itself, when it came, was nothing like the clean and distant thing that official Egyptian art depicted. The official record of a battle like Kadesh, where Rameses II fought the Hittites to an effective draw that was subsequently represented by Egyptian propaganda as a magnificent personal victory, shows the pharaoh as a superhuman figure single handedly routing his enemies. The reality shown by the battle's tactical situation was closer to a near disaster in which the Egyptian forces were ambushed, the royal division nearly overwhelmed, and the outcome uncertain for long enough that the future of Egyptian power in the region hung in the balance. The soldiers who fought at Kadesh, who held their positions or failed to hold them, who were wounded or killed or captured, who stumbled back through the Syrian landscape afterward in whatever condition they had survived, none of them appear in the official record as individuals. They are the generic mass of the pharaoh's army, the background against which the divine hero operates his superhuman magnificence. They fought, they bled, they died, and the record of what happened at Kadesh was a poem about Rameses. Wounds in ancient warfare, treated with the medical knowledge available in the ancient world, had outcomes that ranged from full recovery to slow death from infection. Egyptian military medicine was more sophisticated than many people realize. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the earliest known surgical text, deals with trauma injuries in a way that suggests genuine clinical observation accumulated over generations of treating battle wounds. But sophisticated by ancient standards still meant operating without antibiotics, without sterile technique in the modern sense, and with a limited ability to address internal injuries that were beyond the reach of the available interventions. The soldier who survived a campaign returned to his village changed. He had seen things that the village would not have prepared him for. He had killed people or watched people be killed. He had experienced the particular intimate violence of ancient close quarters combat, which required a completely different psychological adaptation from the long distance weapons of modern warfare. He may have returned with an injury that would define the rest of his life. He may have returned with diseases picked up during the campaign that had no treatment available to him. And if the pharaoh required him to go again in the next campaign season, he would go, because the pharaoh required it. Everything in ancient Egypt happened in a climate that was working against the people trying to do things in it. Modern Egyptians managed the Egyptian summer with air conditioning, refrigeration, electric fans, UV protective clothing, and a public health infrastructure that monitors and responds to heat-related illness. Ancient Egyptians had the Nile, shade, linen, and whatever the human body could do on its own behalf. The combination of extreme heat and the kind of sustained physical labor demanded by the pharaoh's household and building projects created conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits on a regular basis. The Egyptian climate in summer regularly produces temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius in the interior regions. The desert that surrounded the agricultural Nile Valley added its own contribution through the Khamsin, the hot, dusty wind that blew in from the western desert periodically, filling the air with fine particles that got into everything: food, water, lungs, eyes, tools, stored goods. The sandstorms that the Khamsin could produce were disorienting, damaging, and capable of turning a normal working day into a survival exercise. Dehydration was a constant risk for people performing heavy labor in this climate. The human body loses water through sweat at rates that escalate sharply under conditions of physical exertion in high heat. The workers on the pyramid sites received beer and water as part of their rations, and the presence of water in the rations was not incidental. It was a calculated response to the physiological needs of a workforce that could not function effectively while dehydrated. When the logistics of supply broke down, when the supply chain for water or beer to a remote work site was disrupted, the health of the workforce deteriorated quickly. Heat stroke was a genuine occupational hazard. The symptoms of serious heat exhaustion and heat stroke, confusion, loss of coordination, collapse, in severe cases, death, were not understood in the physiological terms we use today, but were recognized as conditions that afflicted people who worked too long in the sun without adequate water. The management of this risk was part of the implicit logistics of any major work undertaking, but the management was imperfect, and people suffered and died from heat related conditions at work sites throughout Egyptian history. The dust of the construction sites produced respiratory disease that was another form of long term occupational damage. Silica dust, the fine particles produced by cutting and grinding stone, causes a progressive scarring of the lung tissue that impairs breathing and eventually becomes fatal. Silicosis, as the resulting condition is called, was not identified as a distinct disease in the ancient world, but the lungs of ancient Egyptians, examined by modern pathologists, show evidence of the condition at rates consistent with regular exposure to stone dust. The stone cutters and builders of the royal monuments were literally sacrificing their respiratory capacity to the pharaoh's eternity. The same examination of mummified remains and skeletal material has revealed a population under persistent parasitic pressure. Schistosomiasis, caused by waterborne parasitic worms that penetrate the skin of people working in irrigation water, was extremely common in ancient Egypt. Its effects included chronic fatigue, abdominal pain, liver and kidney damage, and in severe cases, death. The Nile irrigation system that made Egypt's agricultural abundance possible also provided ideal conditions for the parasites that undermined the health of the people who worked in and around the water. Malaria was present. Eye diseases, particularly trachoma, were extremely common, as evidenced by the frequency with which eye treatments appear in Egyptian medical texts. Dental disease was universal and severe, driven by the grit in the bread that damaged tooth enamel over decades of daily eating. Dental abscesses killed people in the ancient world. There was nothing to be done about them once they reached a certain stage. The royal physician could treat the pharaoh's dental problems with the best available ancient interventions. The worker who developed an abscess from a lifetime of eating gritty bread worked until he could not and then died. All of this was the physical context in which service to the pharaoh was performed. The grand ceremonies, the elaborate rituals, the beautiful objects produced for the divine household, all of it was underlaid by the grinding biological reality of human bodies working past their comfortable limits in a harsh climate, accumulating damage that they carried for the rest of their lives, and that the history books never mention. Service to a divine king was not something you could resign from. The concept of simply deciding to stop, of walking away from a position in the pharaoh's household because the conditions were unpleasant or the demands unreasonable, did not exist in any practical sense for most people in the ancient Egyptian system. The society was organized on principles of hierarchical obligation that ran from the divine king at the top through every layer of society down to the agricultural laborer at the bottom. Each person owed service, labor, and loyalty to those above them. Leaving was not an option. And if leaving was not an option, the corollary was that the fear of punishment for errors, inadequacies, or transgressions was a permanent feature of the working environment. The Egyptian legal and disciplinary system was sophisticated and, by the standards of the ancient world, sometimes notable for its attempt to apply consistent principles. There were courts, there were hearings, there were records, there were appeals. The legal machinery that operated at the level of the broader society was real and functional. But the power dynamics of service to the pharaoh operated within a framework where the divine king's authority was absolute and where transgression against that authority was not merely a legal matter but a theological one. The records that survive from Egypt's ancient courtrooms and administrative archives give us glimpses into what happened when things went wrong in the royal service. One of the most dramatic surviving examples is the record of what has come to be called the harem conspiracy of Rameses III, a plot in the late 20th dynasty in which a group of palace women, their male allies outside the harem, and several officials within the royal household conspired to assassinate the pharaoh and place a different heir on the throne. The conspiracy failed, or partially failed, and the surviving trial records give us detailed information about what happened to the people involved. The punishments were severe. Participants in the conspiracy were tried before special courts and subjected to sentences that included death and mutilation. Some of the conspirators were, in a dark irony, permitted to execute the sentence on themselves rather than have it imposed from outside, a form of honor killing that acknowledged their former status while ensuring the punishment was still carried out. The records are matter of fact about all of this in a way that tells us something about how the system understood the nature of betrayal against the divine person. But the fear of punishment was not limited to conspirators. It was a feature of everyday service. Egyptian administrative texts make clear that overseers had the authority to physically punish workers who fell short of quotas or who failed in their assigned duties. The stick appears frequently in Egyptian representations of workplaces as the supervisor's tool of motivation. The beating of workers who did not meet targets was apparently routine enough that it was depicted without particular comment. For servants in direct proximity to the pharaoh, the stakes were different but no less serious. An error in the morning ritual could bring down severe consequences. A food taster who failed to detect something problematic in the royal food supply had failed in one of the most critical protective roles in the palace. The servant who damaged a sacred object, who was discovered having said something disloyal, who was accused by a rival of an impropriety, all of these faced the full weight of a system that took very seriously the obligation to maintain the divine order. The psychological climate that this created for palace servants was one of perpetual vigilance. You had to be good at your job. You had to be seen to be good at your job. You had to manage your relationships with other servants carefully because rivals had every incentive to report your shortcomings to those above you. You had to perform your duties in a state of controlled attention at all times, suppressing the natural human desire to rest, to complain, to move carelessly, to think about something other than the task immediately before you. The performance was total, and the penalty for dropping it could be severe. There was also the more mundane but pervasive reality of bureaucratic accountability. The Egyptian state was an administrative state of extraordinary thoroughness. Its scribes kept records of everything: grain deliveries, labor quotas, material inventories, ration distributions, building project progress, temple offerings, military provisions. This record keeping was not incidental to the system. It was how the system knew whether it was functioning correctly and where it was falling short. For servants at every level of the hierarchy, this meant that their performance was not merely observed, but documented. A worker who regularly fell short of his assigned quota was not just noticed by his immediate overseer. His shortfall was recorded in the administrative documents that moved upward through the reporting chain. A cook who produced food that was returned as unsatisfactory had created a record of that failure. A scribe who produced documents with errors had produced evidence of his inadequacy that could be reviewed and acted upon at any time. The comprehensive nature of Egyptian record keeping meant there was no escaping the administrative record of your performance. In an environment where most people had no ability to read or write, and therefore could not inspect or contest the documents being kept about them, this created a significant power asymmetry between the literate administrators who maintained the records and the largely illiterate workers whose performance was being recorded. The official version of your service was whatever the scribe wrote down, and you had no mechanism to dispute it. For the servant who understood this, the prudent response was to cultivate the goodwill of the scribes and officials who maintained the records of your performance. A scribe who liked you might record your quota shortfall less severely than the strict facts warranted. An official who had reason to favor you might write a recommendation that obscured a marginal performance. The cultivation of these relationships was itself a form of labor that added to the already substantial demands of the actual job. And underneath all of this was the simple reality that in a society organized around the absolute authority of the divine king, the servant had no fundamental recourse. What you could do was perform your duties as well as possible, manage your relationships as carefully as possible, and hope that the enormous impersonal machine of the pharaoh's service ground past you without catching on whatever specific vulnerability you carried. The word harem comes from an Arabic root meaning forbidden or sacred, and it was applied by later scholars to the institution that the Egyptians themselves called the ipetnesut, roughly the king's inner apartments, the place of secluded women. Whatever we call it, the institution was real, substantial, and one of the most significant sites of invisible labor in the pharaoh's Egypt. The royal harem was not simply a residence for the pharaoh's wives and concubines, though it was certainly that. It was also an economic institution of considerable scale. The harems of the New Kingdom pharaohs functioned as productive estates in their own right, managing agricultural land, maintaining weaving workshops, producing linen, raising cattle, and generating income through the management of their assigned resources. The women who resided in these institutions were not simply passive recipients of royal bounty. Many of them were actively engaged in the management and production that kept the institution and its inhabitants fed, clothed, and housed. The weaving workshops of the royal harem were famous for producing the finest linen in Egypt. The quality of linen manufactured in these settings was recognized and prized across the ancient world. Egyptian linen, and particularly the finest grades produced for royal and ritual use, had a delicacy and whiteness that other ancient cultures could not match and greatly admired. The weavers who produced it were skilled specialists whose training had taken years and whose daily output over a lifetime contributed to the textile wealth of one of the world's great civilizations. But the harem was also a place of intense confinement. The women who resided in it could not simply leave. Their movements were managed by the male administrators and officials who oversaw the institution. Their correspondence with the outside world was monitored. Their social contacts were controlled. They lived in physical comfort that exceeded what most Egyptians experienced, in well appointed apartments within a large and managed compound, with food and clothing and medical care provided by the state. And they were, in the essential sense of the word, confined. The psychological dimensions of this confinement are something the historical record touches only obliquely. We have the material evidence of the harem institutions, their land holdings, their administrative records, their architectural remains. We do not have the diaries or letters of the women who lived within them expressing clearly and directly what that life felt like from the inside. Foreign women who arrived in the royal harem as part of diplomatic marriages faced an additional layer of displacement. The diplomatic correspondence of the Amarna period, a collection of clay tablets found in the archives of the pharaoh Akhenaten, includes letters from foreign kings discussing the arrangement of marriages with Egyptian royalty and the fate of their daughters sent to Egypt. One king, in a letter that has survived nearly intact, asks the pharaoh to let him know how his daughter is doing, whether she is alive and well, whether she is happy. The tone of the letter is a father asking after a child he had sent far away to a place he could not reach, who had entered an institution from which she could not return. He never received a satisfactory answer. Whether she was happy, whether she was alive, whether she found in the royal harem something that sustained her, the record does not say. The women who worked in the harem's weaving workshops spent their days doing labor that was recognized as valuable, but was performed under supervision in confinement without the freedom to take their skills elsewhere or to work for their own benefit. The linen they wove went to the pharaoh's household, to the temples, to the officials who received it as payment. Their hands produced it, they kept none of it. Among all the people who served the pharaoh in various capacities throughout Egyptian history, the workers of Deir el-Medina occupy a uniquely documented position. Their village, located in a dry desert valley on the west bank of Thebes near the Valley of the Kings, was home to the craftspeople and their families who worked on the royal tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs for nearly 500 years. These were not unskilled laborers. They were the most specialized workforce in Egypt, painters of extraordinary skill who covered the walls and ceilings of underground tombs with complex religious imagery in colors that have remained vivid for 3,000 years. Sculptors who carved hieroglyphic texts with a precision that modern stonemasons admire, plasterers and carpenters and metalworkers who prepared every surface and every object in the tombs to the standard required for a divine burial. They knew things about the religious program of the royal afterlife that most Egyptians were never permitted to know because they had spent their working lives inside the texts and images that described it. The nature of their work was unusual in ways that went beyond the technical demands of the craft. They were building the pharaoh's eternal home. They were creating the space in which the most powerful person in Egypt would spend his afterlife, decorated with the images that would activate and maintain that afterlife for eternity. The religious weight of this responsibility was real to them. They understood themselves to be doing sacred work, and the care with which they executed even the details that would be sealed inside the tomb and never seen again by living eyes reflects that understanding. But the conditions of their work were genuinely difficult. The royal tombs were cut deep into the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, descending through multiple corridors and chambers to the burial room. Working underground in these tombs meant working by lamplight, oil lamps that burned castor oil and produced light sufficient for the detailed work of painting and carving, but also produced smoke that accumulated in the enclosed spaces. The ventilation of the royal tombs was limited by their design, and the air quality in the working chambers, with multiple lamps burning and multiple workers generating body heat and exhaling carbon dioxide, was poor. The physical conditions of chiseling limestone in these underground spaces produced the same stone dust problems that affected workers above ground, but concentrated in enclosed spaces where there was nowhere for the dust to go except into the workers' lungs. The evidence for respiratory disease in this population, as in the larger pyramid building workforce, is consistent with chronic exposure to the conditions of their labor. The Deir el Medina records also reveal the interpersonal realities of a small community that spent generations doing the same work in the same isolated valley. The legal records from the village show disputes over inheritance, over theft, over borrowed items not returned, over allegations of various frictions of close community life. These were real people with real conflicts embedded in a community from which there was essentially no exit. The village was staffed by hereditary craftspeople whose children followed them into the same work. You were born into this community, and you remained in it. The documents from Deir el Medina include love poetry, medical texts, legal records, work logs, letters, a remarkable archive of human life preserved by the dryness of the desert environment. Reading through this archive, you encounter people complaining about the same things people complain about today. Work that is not properly recognized, supplies that arrive late or not at all, colleagues who do not carry their weight, officials who are unjust or incompetent. The specifics are ancient. The human temperature of the complaints is entirely recognizable. The first recorded labor strike in history appears in the records of Deir el Medina, dating to the reign of Rameses III. When the workers' rations were not delivered on time, the workforce stopped work walked to the administrative buildings near the Valley of the Kings and sat down. They sent messages to the local administrator explaining that they were hungry and could not work. They did not leave. They did not abandon their tools. They staged a structured work stoppage and waited for the problem to be resolved. The records suggest they got their rations. The strike worked. These were not people who had entirely surrendered their agency. They understood their own value to the system and used that knowledge as leverage in a moment of institutional failure. They built some of the most beautiful spaces ever created by human hands. The tomb of Sennacherib at Deir el Medina, painted by a master craftsperson who worked on the royal tombs during the day, contains agricultural scenes of such vivid joy and technical accomplishment that they stop people in their tracks 3,000 years later. He knew what he was doing. He had spent his life developing the skill to do it. And he did it for the pharaoh, year after year, in underground chambers lit by oil lamps, breathing limestone dust, until the time came to do it one last time for himself. When the pharaoh finally retired from the day's ceremonies and audiences and rituals and was settled for the night, the work of the palace did not end. Night in the royal household was its own world of service, quieter than the day, but no less demanding for those who inhabited it. The body of the divine king had to be protected through the hours of darkness. The functions of the palace that operated without pause had to continue, and the servants who had worked through the day had to hand off to those whose shift began when the sun went down and did not end until it rose again. The guards who protected the royal household through the night stood their watches in the deep silence of palace corridors, in the heat of Egyptian summer nights, in the relative cold of winter nights when the desert temperature dropped sharply after dark. Standing guard for several hours at a time, maintaining alertness, staying awake and attentive when the body is designed to be asleep at these hours. This is something that military and security services have grappled with throughout history, and the basic biological challenge of night watch has not changed. The body wants to sleep when it is dark and quiet. Preventing it from doing so, hour after hour, shift after shift, was an act of sustained self-control that had its own costs. The priests responsible for the nighttime aspects of the divine king's ritual care performed their duties in lamplight, maintaining the sacred fire, ensuring the ritual requirements of the night hours were met. Egyptian religious practice recognized night as its own sacred time with its own divine presences and its own ritual obligations. The priests who served these night requirements were often different specialists from the day priests, their training oriented toward the specific theological content of the nocturnal hours. The kitchen workers who began preparations for the next day's meals started well before dawn, which meant they were working during the hours when most of the palace was at its quietest. The baker's day began in the night effectively, so that bread would be ready when the divine household required it at the start of the new day's rituals. These workers moved through their preparations in the darkness and lamplight of the early hours, invisible to the official record, preparing the food that would be presented with great ceremony to the divine being who was still sleeping. The washermen and launderers, workers who maintained the extraordinary quantities of linen that a royal household consumed, often did their heaviest work during the cooler hours. Linen washing in ancient Egypt was done in the Nile or in large basins using natron or other cleaning agents and involved beating, wringing, and rinsing fabric on a large scale. The volume of linen in a royal household was enormous. Processing it required a workforce that worked across the full cycle of the day and night. The Nile itself was a nighttime presence around the palace complex. Its sounds and smells part of the ambient environment of Egyptian royal life. During the inundation season, when the river flooded its banks and covered the agricultural land in the nutrient rich silt that was the basis of Egyptian prosperity, the palace sat closer to water than at other times of year. The sound of the flood, the smell of it, the particular quality of the night air during inundation, all of this was the background against which the palace's nighttime work happened. By the time the first light began to touch the sky to the east, and the pre dawn preparations began again in every department of the royal household, the night servants were handing back to the day servants, and the cycle that had no real beginning and no real end continued its rotation. The pharaoh slept and woke and slept again, tended at every hour of every night and every day by people who themselves did not always have the luxury of sleeping when they needed to, eating when they were hungry, resting when they were tired. The divine body was the organizing center of everything. Everything else organized itself around it. Step back from the individual details for a moment. Look at the full span of what we have been discussing tonight, and a particular shape becomes visible. Ancient Egypt lasted as a continuous civilization with recognizable institutions and a continuous cultural tradition for roughly 3,000 years. 3,000 years of pharaonic divine kingship, of pyramid building and tomb painting and temple construction and military campaigns and administrative complexity. 3,000 years of the extraordinary machine of state that produced the monuments we still travel to see and the texts we still read with admiration. 3,000 years is a duration so far beyond ordinary human comprehension that we tend to flatten it into a single, undifferentiated block called Ancient Egypt, as if the Old Kingdom pyramid builders and the New Kingdom tomb painters and the late period temple priests were all somehow contemporaries. They were not. The time between the Great Pyramid of Khufu and the death of Cleopatra is longer than the time between the death of Cleopatra and today. The civilization that built the pyramids was as ancient to the Egyptians of the New Kingdom as the New Kingdom Egyptians are to us. What sustained this civilization through that enormous span of time? Not the pharaohs, who changed constantly, not the specific political arrangements of any given dynasty, which rose and fell and sometimes disappeared entirely into the chaos of intermediate periods. What sustained it was the accumulated labor and skill and knowledge of generations of workers, craftspeople, administrators, farmers, priests, and soldiers who kept the fundamental practices of Egyptian civilization going despite everything that happened at the political level. The farmers who worked the Nile flood plain and produced the grain surplus that fed the cities and the projects and the army. The craftspeople who preserved and transmitted the technical knowledge required to produce Egyptian art and architecture. The priests who maintained the ritual practices that gave Egyptian civilization its religious continuity. The scribes who copied and preserved the texts that constituted Egypt's cultural memory. All of these people, working in their various capacities of service to the pharaonic state, were also the living substance of the civilization itself. The pharaoh was the theological center of the system. He was its organizing principle and its divine legitimation, but he was not its actual content. The actual content was the knowledge, skill, labor, and accumulated practice of the people who served him. When a dynasty fell and a new one rose, the pharaoh changed. The craftspeople kept working, the farmers kept farming, the scribes kept writing. The accumulated competence of the serving population was more durable than the specific political arrangements of any given period. This does not make the service less demanding or the suffering less real. The arthritic knees of the grain grinders were not made better by their historical significance. The silicotic lungs of the stone workers did not benefit from being part of a 3,000-year tradition. The children who grew up in the service of the royal household and never knew any other life were not compensated for their lack of freedom by the eventual appreciation of the objects their labor helped produce. But it does add a dimension to the story that simple accounts of suffering and exploitation sometimes miss. These people were not only victims of a system, they were also its authors. The civilization that produced the pyramids and the tombs and the texts and the jewelry and all the other things that still compel our attention was produced by them. Their skill, their knowledge, their accumulated practice, their transmitted learning, these were the actual substance of what we call ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was the divine head. They were the living body. And the body remembered things that the head never had to think about. It remembered the weight of stone, the sting of desert wind, the smell of the flood, the sound of the chisel in the dark, and the particular quality of silence that falls over a group of workers who have finally been brought their bread. These were not small things. They were the texture of the civilization itself. And the living body endured through 3,000 years of heat and dust and hard labor and hierarchical demand and the daily requirement to subordinate personal need to the service of something larger than any individual. It endured. It built its impossible monuments. It created its extraordinary beauty. It maintained its complex civilization across a span of time that makes most human achievements look brief by comparison. That it sucked to do all of this, that the cost was real and was paid in human bodies and human time and human freedom, is true. That the people who paid it were capable of extraordinary things is equally true. Both things are part of the story. Both things are worth carrying with you into the quiet of this late evening, as the details soften and the images drift, and the warm, particular darkness of ancient Egypt fades into the ordinary darkness of wherever you are right now. Everything in the pharaoh's Egypt was organized around the Nile. The river was not simply the water supply of a civilization. It was the civilization's engine, its calendar, its theology, and its most demanding employer all at once. The inundation of the Nile, the annual flooding that deposited nutrient-rich silt across the agricultural land of the Nile Valley, was the event around which the entire Egyptian year revolved. Its timing, its height, its coverage of the floodplain determined whether Egypt would eat or go hungry. A low flood meant insufficient coverage of the agricultural land and a poor harvest. A flood that was too high could destroy villages, dikes, and infrastructure. A flood of the right height, at the right time, covering the right areas, meant abundance, and it was the pharaoh's divine relationship with the cosmic order, his maintenance of Ma, that was understood to guarantee the Nile's correct behavior year after year. This theology placed an enormous practical burden on the servants whose work was connected to the river. The irrigation system that extended the reach of the Nile's water beyond the natural flood zone into additional agricultural land was a vast infrastructure that required constant maintenance by human labor. The network of canals, dikes, sluices, and reservoirs that made the irrigation system function had to be inspected, repaired, cleared of silt, and managed throughout the year by workers who received their direction from agricultural officials who reported up through the administrative chain that ended with the pharaoh's household. The work of maintaining the irrigation system was continuous and physically demanding. Clearing accumulated silt from canal beds required workers to get into the water and dig it out by hand using simple tools. Repairing dikes after the flood recession meant moving large quantities of earth. The labor involved touched the lives of virtually every agricultural worker in Egypt because the maintenance of the irrigation system was a communal obligation enforced by the state. During the inundation itself, when the flood covered the agricultural land and normal field work was impossible, the state mobilized the temporarily displaced agricultural workforce for other labor. This was the primary season for the major building projects. The pyramid builders, the workers who quarried and transported and placed the millions of stones of the great monuments, were overwhelmingly agricultural workers who had been conscripted during the flood season when their fields were underwater and they could be put to other use without disrupting the agricultural cycle. This was logical from the state's administrative perspective. The workers were available. The state was already organized to feed and house them. The building projects required a workforce at a scale that only the mass mobilization of the agricultural population could provide. The logic was clean and efficient. For the individual farmer who spent one season of every year working on a pyramid site instead of at home with his family, the logic of the administration was less relevant than the reality of the work. The return of the flood each year was celebrated as a religious event of enormous significance. The Wepet Renpe festival, the New Year celebration that coincided with the heliacal rising of the star Sirius and the beginning of the inundation, was one of the most important moments in the Egyptian ceremonial calendar. The pharaoh's participation in the rituals associated with the flood's arrival affirmed his divine role as the guarantor of the river's beneficence. The priests who conducted these ceremonies, the officials who managed the flood measurement system using the nilometers built at key points along the river to track the water's rise, the scribes who recorded the measurements and projected the harvest. All of these people were engaged in the most important agricultural intelligence operation of the ancient world. The nilometer readings were sent to the central administration with urgency. A reading that suggested a poor flood meant immediate calculations about grain reserves and the possible need for rationing. A reading that suggested an adequate or excellent flood meant different calculations about labor mobilization and the capacity for major building projects in the coming season. The pharaoh's administrators managed Egypt's food security through a system of grain storage and redistribution that was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably sophisticated. Grain was stored in state granaries during good years and distributed during lean years. The system worked when it worked with a reliability that helped Egypt survive conditions that would have destroyed less organized civilizations. But the system worked because of the labor that maintained it. The workers who dug the canals, cleared the silt, repaired the dikes, monitored the flood, harvested the grain, transported it to the granaries, recorded its quantity, and distributed it when needed. These were the people whose unglamorous daily labor made Egyptian civilization possible. None of them appear by name in the great inscriptions on the temple walls. None of them are depicted receiving rewards from the pharaoh for their contribution to the management of the flood. They are the background against which history happened, the foundation on which everything else was built, and the foundation endured. Season after season, flood after flood, for 3,000 years, the workers of Egypt showed up and did the work that kept the river working for the people who lived beside it. They did not do it because they had chosen to. They did it because the state required it, and the state's requirements were backed by the authority of a man they had been told, and had perhaps come to believe, was a god. The pharaoh's Egypt was also a world of extraordinary sacred complexity, and that complexity required its own army of specialists whose labor is rarely discussed alongside the more physically obvious forms of service. The temples of ancient Egypt were not simply places of worship in the sense that the word evokes today. They were economic institutions of the first order, controlling enormous land holdings, vast herds of cattle, fleets of fishing boats, workshops producing luxury goods, and agricultural operations employing thousands of workers. The temple economy was, in many periods of Egyptian history, the second largest economic force in Egypt after the royal household itself, and the two were deeply intertwined because the temples existed to serve the gods who legitimated the pharaoh's authority, and the pharaoh was responsible for maintaining the temples that served those gods. The priests who worked in the great temples at Karnak, at Luxor, at Abydos, at Memphis, at Heliopolis, and all the hundreds of smaller temple complexes that dotted the Egyptian landscape were not full-time religious professionals in the modern sense. In most periods and most temples, the priesthood was organized on a rotation system. Priests served for 1 month out of every 4, performing the daily ritual service to the temple's divine statue, and spent the remaining 3 months at their civilian occupations. This meant the priesthood was a large and distributed body of people, many of them holding other positions in Egyptian society simultaneously. But the full-time staff of major temple complexes, the permanent administrators, the specialist ritual performers, the overseers of the temple's economic operations, these were people whose entire working lives were consumed by the institution. The head priests of major temples controlled resources and exercised authority comparable to senior government officials. The high priest of Amun at Karnak, in the later periods of the New Kingdom, wielded power that at times rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. Below the senior clergy stretched a hierarchy of lesser priests, ritual specialists, purifiers, chanters, and musicians whose daily duties were prescribed in minute detail. The morning ritual performed at the divine statue in a major temple involved specific prayers spoken at specific moments, specific offerings presented in a specific sequence, specific physical actions performed with specific tools in specific ways. The priest responsible for these rituals had to have them memorized completely. Improvisation was not permitted. Deviation was error. The gods, like the pharaoh, required perfect service. The animal cults of ancient Egypt add another dimension to this picture that is easy to overlook. Egypt's religious tradition included the veneration of sacred animals who were understood to embody or represent specific deities. The Apis bull at Memphis was the most famous of these, a single animal identified by specific physical markings, who was believed to be a living manifestation of the god Ptah and whose well being was therefore a matter of theological significance. When an Apis bull died, Egypt mourned in official terms. A new bull had to be identified, confirmed by the priests, whose job it was to make this determination, and installed with elaborate ceremony. The care of the Apis bull was a full time occupation for the priests and servants responsible for it. The animal lived in special quarters, ate special food, was treated with the reverence appropriate to a divine being, and was attended by people whose entire professional identity was organized around the maintenance of this one creature. The same principle applied on smaller scales to the sacred ibises and baboons of Thoth's cult at Hermopolis, to the crocodiles of Sobek's cult at Crocodilopolis, to the cats of Bastet's cult at Bubastis. The management of sacred animal cults involved not just the care of the living animals, but an enormous industry of mummification and burial. At Saqqara, archaeologists have found galleries containing literally millions of mummified animals, ibises and falcons and cats and baboons and dogs and crocodiles, offerings produced over centuries by a religious economy that employed craftspeople in the preparation of these objects, priests in the management of their production and sale, and workers in the excavation and maintenance of the galleries that housed them. These were real jobs performed by real people who spent their working lives in close proximity to animals, to embalming materials, to the processes of death and preservation that Egyptian religious practice demanded at industrial scale. The smell of the embalming chemicals, the physical work of wrapping thousands of small bodies in linen bandages, the management of the animal populations that supplied this industry. All of this was the mundane reality behind the sacred appearance, and all of it ultimately served the theological system that placed the pharaoh at its center. The temples honored the gods legitimated the pharaoh maintained the temples. The workers who kept all of this running were the hidden infrastructure of a divine economy that went far beyond the palace walls and touched virtually every corner of Egyptian life. Far from the Nile Valley, in the deserts and mountains that bordered Egypt to the east and south and west, another category of royal servant suffered in relative isolation. The raw materials required by the pharaoh's household and the state institutions that served it did not simply appear. They had to be found, extracted, and transported across enormous distances in conditions that made the climate of the Nile Valley look temperate by comparison. The eastern desert held gold deposits. The Sinai held turquoise and copper. Nubia to the south provided gold in quantities that made Egypt the wealthiest state in the ancient world for extended periods. The quarries at Aswan provided granite for obelisks and statues. The quarries at Tura provided the white limestone used for the outer casing of the pyramids. The quarries at Hatnub provided alabaster. Lebanon provided cedar that Egypt could not grow. Getting these materials required organized expeditions that the state sent out from the Nile Valley into the wilderness on a regular basis throughout Egyptian history. The records of these expeditions survive in inscriptions left at the quarry and mining sites themselves, texts carved into the rock face that recorded the name of the pharaoh who ordered the expedition, the official leading it, and sometimes the size of the workforce involved. These inscriptions are the official face of the expeditions, celebrating their success and the abundance they brought back to the divine king. What the inscriptions do not record is what it was actually like to be one of the workers on these expeditions. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea is one of the most hostile environments in the world. It receives almost no rainfall. Temperatures in summer regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. Shade is found only in rock outcroppings and the limited shadow of cliff faces. Water sources are rare and often unreliable. The terrain is rough and demanding, difficult to traverse on foot, even without carrying heavy loads. The workers who extracted stone and ore from the eastern desert quarries and mines lived in camps established at the work sites for the duration of the expedition. These camps were supplied by a logistics chain that stretched back to the Nile Valley and that had to function reliably to keep the workforce alive and capable of working. When the supply chain functioned well, the workers were fed, watered, and sheltered adequately. When it broke down, the consequences could be severe. The Sinai turquoise mines at Serabit el Kadim are among the best documented of the Egyptian mining sites. Expeditions were sent there from the Old Kingdom period onward, and the inscriptions left at the site record what appears to be a consistent pattern. The mines were worked primarily in the cooler months of the year, and even the Egyptians who organized these expeditions recognized that working in the Sinai in summer was a different proposition from working there in winter. Texts from the Middle Kingdom period include remarkably direct statements from expedition leaders, acknowledging that the conditions were difficult and expressing pride that they had managed to work the mines successfully despite the challenges. One official notes that the stone was worked in a summer month that no one had previously attempted, and the pride in the statement suggests that this was genuinely unusual and recognized as such. The gold mines of Nubia operated continuously throughout the period of Egyptian imperial control of the region, from the Middle Kingdom through the New Kingdom. The descriptions left by ancient sources of the conditions in these mines are among the most disturbing in the ancient record. The Greek historian Agatharchides, writing centuries after the peak of Egyptian power but describing conditions that had probably not changed fundamentally, produced a descriptions of workers of all ages, men and women and children, laboring underground with lamps attached to their foreheads, hacking at rock faces in the heat and darkness, barely fed, forbidden to stop work, dying at their labor. He describes their captors as having no sympathy for the weakness or sickness of those who could not maintain the required pace. Not all workers in Egyptian mines were in this extreme situation. The workforce at different sites in different periods included conscripted free workers, enslaved prisoners of war, and various combinations thereof. The conditions varied accordingly, but the mines of Nubia, at the southern extreme of Egypt's imperial reach, were places where the harshest forms of forced labor were concentrated. The gold that came back to Egypt from those mines, which funded the military campaigns and the building projects and the diplomatic gifts that maintained Egypt's position as the dominant power of the ancient Near East, was purchased with human suffering at a remove sufficient that the pharaoh in his palace did not have to think about it. The finished objects made from these materials, the golden jewelry, the turquoise inlaid pectorals, the granite obelisks, the alabaster canopic jars, are some of the most beautiful objects ever made by human hands. Their beauty is real. The cost at which the raw materials were obtained is equally real. Both facts belong to the same story, even though the museum cases that now hold these objects present only the beauty and leave the cost entirely invisible. And so we have come to the end of another long, quiet evening together. We have walked through the pre-dawn preparations of servants roused before sunrise to ready the palace for a god. We have stood in the heat of royal kitchens where bakers worked through the night and cooks sweated over open fires to feed a divine household. We have followed the fan bearer through hours of silent, aching attendance, the royal physician through the impossible pressure of keeping a god alive, the builders through the grinding physical cost of constructing an eternity in stone. We have looked at the miners in the Sinai desert and the Nubian gold mines, laboring in conditions of extreme hardship to extract the raw materials of divine splendor. We have stood in the sacred animal temples and the weaving workshops of the royal harem. We have descended into the underground chambers of the Valley of the Kings with the craftspeople who spent their working lives in lamplight and stone dust. We have watched the night guards stand their watches in the desert dark, and the launderers beat the divine household's linen against the stones of the Nile bank in the early morning. All of these people, the scribes and the soldiers and the cooks and the barbers and the builders and the weavers and the priests and the miners and the countless others whose specific roles this evening did not have time to reach. All of them were real. They had names, though history forgot most of them. They had families and friendships and conflicts and ambitions and fears and the full range of experience that constitutes a human life. They worked in a system that regarded them primarily as instruments of the divine king's needs, and they found within that system whatever meaning and dignity and connection they could. It sucked. In ways large and small, obvious and subtle, it genuinely sucked. The heat and the dust and the chronic disease and the accumulated bodily damage and the fear and the lack of freedom and the total subordination of everything you were to the service of everything the pharaoh needed. All of it was real. The arthritic grain grinders and the silicotic stone cutters and the soldiers with their unrecorded wounds and the harem women with their unrecorded grief. None of them are footnotes. They are the story. They are what ancient Egypt actually was, beneath the gold and the grandeur. And yet they built the pyramids. They painted the tombs. They wrote the medical texts and the love poems and the administrative records that we still read with amazement 5,000 years later. They ground the grain and brewed the beer and raised the children and struck for their rations when the system failed them. The workers of Deir el Medina sat down in the desert and waited for someone to bring them their bread. And the bread came, and they went back to work and painted something that is still beautiful today. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, remarkable. The fan bearer who ached through hours of steady waving, the barber whose hands touched a god, the scribe who bent over his papyrus in the lamplight and wrote down the names of things so they would be remembered, the builder who set one more stone in the heat, and then another, until the horizon held something that had never existed before, all of them remarkable, all of them real, all of them worth remembering. They were people, complicated, enduring, sometimes brilliant, sometimes exhausted, always human people, doing extraordinary things in circumstances that most of us will never have to face. As you settle deeper into wherever you are resting right now, let the images soften. The lamplight of a pre-dawn kitchen, the sound of stone being cut in the desert heat somewhere far from the river, the careful hands of a royal barber working in silence on a divine head, the smell of the Nile flood in late summer, and the sound of it moving against the palace walls in the dark, the workers of Deir el Medina sitting down in protest with their tools beside them, waiting patiently for someone to bring them their bread. Let it all grow quieter, more distant, like the whisper of papyrus reeds at the edge of the Nile, bending in a warm evening wind, and then still again. There is nothing you need to do right now, no work waiting, no obligations pressing, no divine body whose perfect attendance requires your immediate and flawless attention. Just this moment and the slow, easy weight of rest that your own body is ready to accept. If sleep has already found you, that is wonderful. If you are still just at the edge of it, let these last words carry you the rest of the way. When you wake, please leave a soft comment letting me know where you were listening from tonight and what time it was there. It always means so much to know how far these quiet stories travel in the dark. So many people in so many different corners of the world, all settling into the same quiet hours together. Thank you for spending this evening with Drowsy History. Rest well wherever you are until the next quiet night. If you enjoyed this kind of slow, careful walk through the lives of the people history tends to overlook, there are many more evenings like this one waiting for you here on Drowsy History. The channel is built for exactly this, for the long, quiet hours when the day is done and the mind needs somewhere gentle to go. Subscribe if you have not already, and the next story will find you when you need it. There is always another one waiting in the dark, ready to carry you somewhere ancient and far away, at whatever pace your body needs tonight.